The early March breeze drifted gently across the lake, thin wisps of mist curling around the somber willow trees by the shore, making the whole town of Westlake appear as if it was draped in a veil of haze, caught somewhere between winter and spring. In this place where red dirt roads intertwined among old wooden houses, rumors about a small pharmacy were spreading faster than the season's first downpour. People said that at the corner of 7th Street, right next to the old bus station, there was a young pharmacist quietly handing out expensive medicines for free to anyone who couldn't afford them. In the little coffee shop at the alley's entrance, stories were whispered back and forth, no one really sure if they were true, but tales about boxes of heart medication medicines that only the well-off dared dream of now somehow found their way into the jacket pockets of retired old men, recently unemployed construction workers, and even young mothers hurrying to take their babies to see the doctor late at night. Some were skeptical, while others murmured in admiration at the silent kindness of someone out there, as if some leftover miracle still existed in an age where everything was measured by money and receipts. Ethan Rivers was no stranger to stories like these, but this time they made him pause. At 53, after 3 decades steering HealthSpring Pharmaceuticals, he knew that every small-town rumor was a sign of something cracking within the very system he had built on the foundation of discipline and control. He had grown up in a ramshackle wooden house near the Southern lumber mill, where his mother, a quiet, endlessly self-sacrificing woman, had often gone hungry just to save a few dollars for medicine for his father and younger brother. The trauma of heart disease had claimed his grandfather, and then left deeper scars in Ethan's memory the day he stood silently before the family altar, powerless because they couldn't scrape together enough money to buy even a few life-saving pills. That experience had forged Ethan into a man of unyielding principles, driving him to build HealthSpring from nothing, turning it into a system of strict standards where no exception was ever allowed. But that morning, as Ethan stood by the window of his 19th floor office, gazing down at the calm blue lake, he knew it was time to leave behind his suit and the glow of the CEO title, and return to being an ordinary man. He decided not to inform anyone, disguising himself as an unemployed plumber, slipping into a worn, faded jacket and a frayed cap, carrying nothing but a prescription for heart medication and a few small bills. Ethan knew that to uncover the truth behind the rumors, he would have to trade his position of power for anonymity, set aside every privilege to listen to the quiet pulse of the town he once called home. And so, the story begins on a misty morning, where the boundary between authority and compassion is tested by the simplest things. Ethan Rivers stood silently under the damp eaves of Westlake Pharmacy, the last raindrops still clinging to the hem of his worn, old jacket. The blue-painted sign above had faded, its letters speckled with rust marks, traces of time that could not be hidden. Inside, cold white light spilled onto the sparse shelves of medicine, the air thick with a mix of antiseptic, floor cleaner, and a heavy quiet that Ethan had not felt in any store within his company's network for a very long time. The counter was small and neat, and behind it stood a young pharmacist, an angular face, pale skin but bright eyes, her hair tied neatly at the nape of her neck. The name tag on her simple white coat read, Mara Lynn. He stepped forward, keeping his voice hoarse and low, the way people sound after too many years living with dust and hard labor. "I'd like to get the medicine on this prescription," he said, sliding the crumpled paper toward Mara, his hand trembling slightly as if accidentally betraying the weakness of someone suffering from illness. Mara glanced at the prescription, her eyes neither hurried nor suspicious. She placed it on the keyboard, checked the system, then looked at him, her voice soft and just above a whisper, $789. Ethan slowly opened his wallet, counting out each small bill. Altogether, it was not even $30. Their eyes met for a brief moment, silence spreading between them like a thick blanket in the middle of winter. Mara seemed to need no further questions, nor did she look the least bit uneasy. With quiet skill, she took a blister pack of medicine, placed it in a paper bag, folded it carefully, then pushed it gently toward him. "Take care of your health," she murmured. That simple phrase echoed in Ethan's mind like the memory of a distant youth, a time when kindness needed neither to be proclaimed nor proven. He awkwardly accepted the bag of medicine, unsure whether to feel grateful or uneasy, realizing that he, the one who had erected strict rules and rigid price lists, was now the person crossing that very boundary thanks to the silent compassion of a stranger. Leaving the pharmacy, Ethan walked slowly down the narrow street, his hand gripping the medicine bag as if holding a fragile secret between two opposing worlds. A strange feeling rose in his chest, both embarrassed and doubtful, because all his life he had believed in the system, believing that to help someone, there first had to be rules to maintain fairness for all. Yet in a fleeting moment, a young pharmacist had shaken that belief with a simple act, offered without explanation or hesitation. There was something in the way Mara Lynn looked at him. In those eyes there was no pity but equality, as if he was neither a burden nor an object of charity, but simply a human being in need of help. Ethan wondered how long it had been since the system he had built had forgotten that feeling, and in the cold of the lakeside morning, he knew this journey would lead him much further, to the very root of what he once thought could never be changed. As Ethan Rivers left Westlake Pharmacy, his steps took him toward a small lakeside cafe, where he sat quietly by a foggy window watching the slow procession of people passing by in the damp morning chill. The bag of medicine rested next to his cup of coffee, and as he absent-mindedly turned the paper bag in his hand, a surge of nameless, tangled emotions welled up inside him. The moment when Mara Lynn slid the medicine toward him without asking for anything more than a simple well-wish made Ethan's mind drift back to those distant, impoverished years, the image of his mother, thin and pale, her eyes ringed with exhaustion, yet always gentle, hiding her own hunger in that old kitchen so she could save food for her husband and children, still determined to scrape together every last cent to buy heart medication for his father whenever an attack struck. The utter helplessness of a child watching his loved ones struggle with illness simply because a few pills were out of reach had carved itself deeply into Ethan's soul, transforming that pain into a relentless drive to build a system where no one would have to choose between life and a stack of bills. It was that silent promise made beside his grandfather's altar, a man who passed away alone for lack of money for medicine, that forged the fierce, disciplined, uncompromising Ethan Rivers throughout his 30-year journey. He poured his entire life's meaning into shaping HealthSpring into a fortress of control and procedure, where every bit of assistance was filtered through files, price lists, and seemingly immutable rules. On countless sleepless nights spent rewriting policy after policy, Ethan would remind himself, only rules can ensure fairness. Only the system can prevent the injustice of randomness. He believed that by following procedure, he was protecting the vulnerable from favoritism and neglect, that an emotionless system would never forget anyone. But reality proved to be more complicated than financial reports and tightly controlled models. Sitting in that cafe on a chilly morning, for the first time in decades, Ethan felt himself standing between two worlds. On one side was his faith in the power of systems. On the other, an instinctive kindness like the one Mara Lynn had quietly shown him. Did the rigid fence of rules he had so painstakingly built truly protect the weak, or did it sometimes become an invisible barrier pushing them farther from the help they desperately needed? Ethan gazed out at the restless lake, his heart filled with a sense of displacement, feeling both like a stranger in his own empire and a child returning to an old home, witnessing familiar scenes repeat themselves in new forms. He began to realize that to reach the ultimate truth of humanity, sometimes one must dare to break the very principles that once felt like their greatest pride. The night before Ethan Rivers disguised himself and stepped into Westlake Pharmacy, the CEO's office at HealthSpring was awash in the dim glow of computer screens and stacks of reports piled high like invisible ramparts. A brief bulletin from the Internal Audit Department had just landed in his inbox, a document unremarkable except for one discrepancy: 3 consecutive months of missing inventory of high-end heart medication at the small lakeside branch, with the total loss exceeding $15,000. It wasn't an amount that could threaten a giant pharmaceutical corporation. But for Ethan, every irregularity, no matter how small, was a signal that something was quietly fracturing within the system he treasured. The closing line of the report was cold and cautious. There are signs of improper drug dispensation, cause undetermined. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his gaze contemplative. After 30 years of closely monitoring every tiny fluctuation at HealthSpring, he knew the ins and outs of inventory procedures, standardized management systems, barcodes, layers of digital firewalls, and a multitude of anti-loss measures that had turned each box of medication into a cog in a relentlessly precise machine. Yet, somewhere, even the machine could leak traces of humanity, gray areas that spreadsheets, reports, and charts could never fully expose. Instead of ordering an investigation or summoning a chain of regional managers, Ethan quietly chose a course of action no one would have expected. He spent the night removing all signs of his identity. The tailored suit, the silver name tag, even the watch that symbolized his power. He told his assistant to cancel all meetings and personally emptied his pockets, leaving only a prescription and $30 in small bills, just like the desperate people who once lined up at the pharmacy counter so long ago. At dawn, Ethan drove an old car borrowed from the logistics garage, blending in with the flow of workers on the outskirts of Westlake, a place no longer tied to illuminated skyscrapers or the feverish sounds of the stock market. Here, everyone carried their own silent story, their own private worries that no system could ever capture in numbers. No one at HealthSpring knew Ethan had left headquarters. No one could have guessed that the head of the corporation was preparing to go undercover, returning to the role of a solitary patient, one who would personally peel back every layer of truth hidden behind those cold numbers. This step was not just a test of the control system, but the greatest challenge yet to his deepest beliefs about justice and compassion. In the cold lakeside morning air, Ethan understood that what he was about to witness might shake every value he had spent a lifetime accumulating down to its very core. Throughout that morning, Ethan Rivers sat quietly on a stone bench across from Westlake Pharmacy, blending into the still rhythm of the lakeside town, invisible amidst the flow of people passing by. The cup of coffee cooled gradually in his hand as he watched every movement behind the misted glass window where Mara Lynn worked in silence, her slender figure moving with a routine etched deep into every gesture. The pharmacy's space was simple and tranquil, with no background music, only the intermittent sound of computer keys, the opening of drawers, and brief exchanges of words. Under Ethan's watchful eyes, the same scenes kept unfolding, as if he were watching a well-rehearsed play where each performance preserved its naturalness. An old man entered, carrying a plastic bag full of small change, his trembling hands placing each coin on the counter. Mara Lynn patiently counted every coin, then offered him a gentle smile, quietly returning the excess change along with a precious pack of heart medication. Not long after, a young mother, exhausted and sleepless, brought in her feverish child and handed over a crumpled prescription. Mara did not ask many questions. She simply slipped into the storeroom, retrieved the medicine, pressed it into the mother's hand, and nodded reassuringly, never asking for payment. An elderly man in a faded army jacket also appeared, his voice rough as he explained his lack of money, but Mara Lynn simply slid the medicine toward him, softly telling him to pay whenever you can. Ethan gradually realized that what he was witnessing was not just a sudden outburst of compassion, but a parallel, steadfast system operating quietly, one meant solely for those on the margins of society, the very people his ideal system had never truly reached. What struck him most was that every time Mara Lynn handed out free medicine, she never entered it into the computer as an official transaction, never printed a receipt, but instead quietly pulled out an old blue notebook from under the counter, its cover frayed at the corners, jotting down a few brief lines, name, date, type of medicine, and sometimes just a small note, come back next Friday. The more he observed, the more Ethan noticed a cold consistency in the way Mara Lynn acted. Never rushed, never emotional, every choice deliberate and measured, as if she were silently running a small rescue network right in the heart of a vast, rule-bound system. It was not negligence, nor a calculated bending of rules for personal gain, but a form of quiet, conscious rebellion where faith in humanity rose above all data and regulations. Each time the pharmacy door closed behind someone who had just been helped, Ethan felt something inside himself stirring powerfully. That silence was no longer the peace of order, but the echo of questions that had never been answered throughout a lifetime spent chasing absolute control. In the days that followed, Ethan Rivers persistently blended into the rhythm of the small town, quietly observing Mara Lynn like an unnamed detective, gathering fragments from moments that seemed utterly ordinary. Beneath his worn old coat, he concealed his amazement and emotion as he watched Mara steadfastly carry out what he had come to recognize as her own personal code, regardless of watchful eyes or the risk of being discovered. More than once, Mara quietly handed out medicine to familiar faces, elderly people with calloused hands and weary eyes, worn out by the constant burden of illness. There was a time Ethan saw Mara greet a teenage boy, his face tense from a severe asthma attack, clutching a prescription hastily written by his mother. She checked the computer, asked no unnecessary questions, simply opened a drawer, took out a new inhaler, and quickly scribbled, "Pay later, return next week," in her old notebook. The boy took the medicine, bowed in gratitude, and rushed out, leaving not a single coin behind. One afternoon, a middle-aged woman arrived, her eyes red from tears, flustered by a prescription for cancer medication left after her mother's passing. Mara gently asked a few questions, selected the most expensive medicine, and didn't ask for any insurance documents or look at the woman's wallet. She simply placed the medicine in a paper bag and wrote a note: "Priority, installment payment, call for further support if needed." Every transaction vanished from the electronic system, yet shone brightly in the blue notebook Mara treasured like a precious keepsake. Notably, Ethan observed, no one left the pharmacy with shame or humiliation in their eyes. They all walked out lighter, as if truly seen and respected, no matter how difficult their circumstances. One day, an old man who had lost his job came to buy arthritis medication, his trembling hands digging for the last coins in his pocket. Mara did not shake her head. She simply said gently, "Just take the medicine, get well, and come back when you can. I'll still be here." Ethan even saw Mara quietly slip a few packets of ginger tea into the old man's bag, offering no explanation. She was like a gentle shield between the sick and the cold world of regulations, using her patience to heal not only bodies but also silent wounds of dignity. Watching each exchange, every respectful gesture, Ethan gradually became aware of a power his system had never been able to capture. The power of listening and compassion that comes from human instinct. In that old notebook, every note held a life story, a seed of trust, a promise to meet again that required no signature or paperwork. Fairness here was no longer about cold numbers, but was measured in empathy, in the meeting of eyes and the beating of hearts. Ethan suddenly felt the boundary between right and wrong within himself blur, replaced by a persistent question. Perhaps sometimes kindness needs neither justification nor fear, only enough steadfastness to see it through to the end, no matter the rules. One afternoon, as a heavy rain swept through the small town of Westlake, filling the air with a cold mist, the pharmacy was suddenly disrupted by commotion outside the glass door. Ethan had just slipped into the corner of the cafe across the street and hadn't even ordered a drink when a scene unfolded that made him spring to his feet. An elderly woman stumbled toward the pharmacy, clutching her chest, her breath short and rapid, her lips tinged blue. Mara Lynn immediately left the counter, dashed through the rain, caught the old woman, checked her pulse, and called her name again and again. While bystanders could only watch in concern, Mara reached into her medical bag, pulled out a nitroglycerin inhaler, gently helped the woman take her medicine, and soothed her with a voice that was eerily calm. Ignoring the rain and cold, Mara stayed by the woman's side, only moving once her breathing began to steady, then led her inside, fetched her water and several supplement pills, all free of charge, quietly saying, "You need this now, the rest can be dealt with later." At that very moment, the door at the back of the pharmacy swung open and a man appeared, stiff posture, gray shirt, and a dark tie Avery Grant, the branch manager recently sent by the corporation to oversee the ongoing losses at West Lake. In Grant's hand was a clipboard packed with paperwork, his face expressionless, bearing the rigidity of a longtime manager. He paused, his gaze falling on Mara Lynn kneeling beside the old woman, his eyes darkening with disapproval. "Again?" Grant snapped. "You just gave out medication without entering it in the system, didn't you?" Mara rose, keeping her composure, though her head bowed slightly. She was having an attack. She couldn't wait for paperwork. "I'll update the records after." Grant's voice hardened. "No one has the right to break procedure. If you keep acting this way, the company faces serious legal risks." Mara didn't argue, only quietly helped the old woman to a seat, then returned to the counter, her gaze unshaken. Avery Grant glanced around, his eyes meeting Ethan's, who was now blending in with the crowd seeking shelter from the rain, but found nothing noteworthy. Grant frowned, gripped his clipboard, and strode straight to the back office, muttering criticisms under his breath. The entire pharmacy was left steeped in a heavy silence. Mara went on with her work, neither justifying herself nor bowing her head. Ethan stood quietly in a corner, witnessing with clarity the tension between two worlds. On one side, the unyielding rules of the corporation. On the other, the fragile existence of human life. In that fleeting moment, he felt deeply the helplessness of the very systems he had built, when every effort to protect life became a violation simply because a note was missing from the electronic records. He knew this conflict would only spread further, and he himself would have to face the greatest question of his life. Where does true justice lie among the countless layers of principles that seem unbreakable? That evening, when the rain had ceased and the small town of West Lake was bathed in the quiet glow of yellow streetlights, Ethan Rivers sat alone in his modest lakeside room, his phone screen replaying the video he had secretly recorded in the pharmacy. Every moment Mara Lynn rushed outside to save the elderly woman. Every exchange between her and manager Avery Grant, Ethan preserved meticulously, without commentary, without judgment, just the rawest images of the conflict between compassion and ironclad procedure. He sent the audio and video files to HealthSpring's internal control department, omitting his identity, with a cold subject line, West Lake, Grant, Mara Lynn. Within a single night, the system responded. The next morning, Mara Lynn noticed the atmosphere in the pharmacy had grown unusually heavy. Grant stationed himself at the counter for longer stretches, monitoring every transaction, even installing more cameras and increasing the frequency of inventory checks. Another female staff member was added to the shift, and an uneasy tension crept into every gesture between the employees. Each time Mara opened her familiar blue notebook, Grant's gaze fixed on her, as if ready to catch any misstep. In just 2 days, the corporate audit department issued an internal notice demanding review of all transactions involving specialty medication at West Lake. Every time Mara Lynn helped a patient in need, taking no payment, updating nothing in the system, Grant marked it in red on his tracking chart. The summary reports quickly made their way to HealthSpring's legal department, described with emotionless language. Employee repeatedly dispenses medication outside of regulations, fails to follow procedure, risk of legal violations and financial loss. No one mentioned the elderly woman whose life had been saved. No one acknowledged the child who received an inhaler just in time. All that remained were numbers and violations in the eyes of the system. A few days later, the Human Resources Department officially sent a summons for Mara Lynn to attend an internal hearing, requiring her to explain in detail every improper transaction from the last 3 months. The incident was labeled a serious violation with immediate risk of suspension and disciplinary action. Every employee at the West Lake Pharmacy realized this was no longer just Mara's issue, it was a warning bell for anyone who dared to put people above procedure. Ethan watched it all unfold in silence, acutely feeling the cold pressure squeezing the very air from the room. For the first time in his entire career, he witnessed the machine he had so painstakingly built, operating like a wild beast out of control. It cared nothing for circumstances, life, or compassion, only seeking to sweep away anyone who defied its rules. Mara's silence, The determination in her eyes, despite knowing the consequences, left Ethan unsettled. He, the creator of the system, had become an unwitting witness to a battle where justice and humanity were being pushed to their harshest limits. Dusk settled gently over the lakeside town, and the pharmacy's neon sign blurred into the thin veil of mist, making the atmosphere at Westlake even heavier. Ethan Rivers stood quietly by the counter while Mara Lynn tended to a patient in the back consultation room. He glanced around, then quickly opened the small drawer where she often hid the faded blue notebook. Its cover was worn, the corners curled, and every page filled with tiny, meticulous handwriting, never careless. There, instead of the system's rigid numbers, Ethan saw an entirely different world. Patient names written simply, beside them the medication dosage, date received, and straightforward notes like "come back Friday," "pay in installments when able," "shortness of breath emergency priority," or even a small line, "feeling better today." Some entries were marked as paid in full, alongside short stories like "hugged me and cried," or "reminded to take care." There was no revenue summary, no one signed to verify, just trails of ink, each like a record of trust and the most personal kind of care. Ethan carefully turned each page, pausing at the name of someone he had seen that very morning. Noah Campbell, the young warehouse worker who always helped Mara with such enthusiasm. Next to his name, the note read, "Noah's mother, emergency on Sunday, recovered, free of charge." His heart sank, a sense of regret spreading through him. When Noah returned and saw Ethan among the boxes of medicine, the young man hesitated, then lowered his voice. "You know, Mara once saved my mother's life. It was the weekend, no doctor on call. I was desperate. Mara arrived in 20 minutes, brought medicine from her own bag, stayed until my mother's breathing was steady before she left. I grew up here. I've seen many pharmacists, but no one has ever cared for patients the way she does." Ethan simply nodded, saying nothing, but Noah's words struck him deeply. He suddenly understood that behind the cold lines of policy violations in the reports were real lives, memories, and relationships woven from countless small, unseen choices. That night, Ethan sat alone in his car, parked quietly behind the pharmacy, watching the yellow lights flicker through the misted glass. Throughout his journey building HealthSpring, he had believed that strict control was the only way a system could survive. But now, after witnessing what that old notebook preserved, he realized he had overlooked a simple truth. No rulebook can ever measure compassion, and no system is complete without memory and human emotion. Ethan knew the time had come for him to confront the greatest doubt of his life, whether the walls he had built over decades were, in the end, nothing more than a shield for his own fear of the inevitable transformation brought by human kindness. That weekend, while the entire town of Westlake remained peaceful under the cool, crisp weather, the atmosphere inside the pharmacy was thrown into turmoil by news of an emergency meeting for all staff. On the notice board, the line, "Urgent meeting, internal investigation on medication dispensing procedures," appeared in stark, cold letters, with the time and place listed just below. Early morning before opening, full attendance required. Avery Grant, in a gray suit and with a stern gaze, chaired the meeting, joined by a HealthSpring audit representative via online connection. Mara Lynn entered with a calm face, betraying neither fear nor defensiveness, simply nodding in greeting to everyone present. In the small room, the faint scent of diluted coffee and the scraping of plastic chairs on the floor made the atmosphere all the more tense. Grant did not waste time, reading the accusation aloud. "Employee Mara Lynn has repeatedly dispensed free medication without recording it in the system, creating serious financial and legal risks for the company." He demanded everyone speak frankly, without reservation. The room immediately split in two, one side made up of younger technicians convinced that strict adherence to protocol was the only way to ensure fairness for customers. The other longtime staff who quietly appreciated Mara, attesting that she had saved lives and helped many through moments of despair. One technician spoke up, his voice sharp. "If she does this without being punished, the rules will become meaningless. Then anyone can break the law." A veteran employee countered, his eyes rimmed red. "If it weren't for Mara, my wife wouldn't have survived that asthma attack last winter. The system doesn't always have every answer. Sometimes you just need someone willing to do the right thing at the right moment. The arguments grew louder, fear of implication tormenting those who had always remained silent. Noah Campbell spoke up boldly. I believe Mara isn't taking advantage of anything. She's simply doing what's necessary. I saw it with my own eyes. Kindness shouldn't be punished. Amid the conflicting voices, Ethan Rivers stood quietly in the corner of the room, his hand gripping the slip of paper bearing his false identity, his eyes reflecting a pain he could not quite name. He felt acutely the fractures his own system had caused, where every decision left people torn between safety and compassion. The small room had become a battlefield between two worlds, one of cold, rigid rules, the other of faith in the goodness of human instinct. Ethan knew it was time he could no longer remain on the sidelines, no longer evade the question of what truly makes up the core values of an organization in which he had once placed all his trust and honor. Amid the cramped room, heavy with division, a deep silence suddenly arose as a stranger, tall and thin, leaning on a cane, entered. His voice trembled as he apologized for interrupting, and then looked at Mara Lynn with an indescribable gratitude in his eyes. I know I shouldn't be here at this hour, he said, but I heard today's meeting is about Mara. If it weren't for her, I wouldn't still be here. She gave me medicine when I had nothing left, not a single document, not a single family member. She never asked why I was poor, never judged my age or my situation. She simply handed me the medication and said, "Come back whenever you can." She saved my life, not once, but many times. No one interrupted, and every eye in the room was fixed on that small old man, his frail voice carrying more weight than any report or justification. Suddenly, Mara Lynn stood up, her slight shoulders steady, her clear eyes gazing straight at everyone. The first time I broke protocol, she spoke, it wasn't because I wanted to rebel, but because I had no other choice. When I was 16, my mother died because we couldn't afford heart medicine. She sat in the hospital corridor all afternoon, waiting for a doctor to sign off on assistance, but no one cared because we didn't have enough money. I begged for medicine at every nearby pharmacy, but rules are rules, and no one dared break them for a ragged girl. My mother died while I was still running through the streets searching for a miracle. On the day of her burial, I promised myself, if I ever worked in this field, I would never let anyone fall into that same despair without having a chance to live. Mara paused, her voice even but her face tightening, pouring all her memories into her final words. I don't see myself as brave, I just don't want to repeat the injustice that killed my mother. If I had to choose again, I would do the same. The whole room fell silent, every argument rendered meaningless in the face of such genuine loss. At that moment, Ethan Rivers slowly removed his faded cap and shrugged off his worn jacket, revealing a face instantly recognizable to anyone at HealthSpring. There was a moment of confusion, a sharp intake of breath, all eyes turned to him in astonishment. Yes, Ethan said calmly. I am the CEO of HealthSpring. I'm here not to supervise, but to seek answers for myself. What have we really created? A system to save lives or a labyrinth of procedures with no way out? He looked around, meeting each gaze. I witnessed with my own eyes what Mara did, things I once believed were wrong, and then I realized my greatest mistake was believing that a tight enough system could protect every life. But in reality, sometimes a single act of compassion can save an entire family. Ethan's voice softened. I cannot and will not punish Mara Lynn. On the contrary, she has reminded me of the original purpose behind founding HealthSpring, to help people, not to stand in the way of kindness. No one said anything more, but the atmosphere seemed lighter, as if the truth had finally been spoken, and everyone understood that this moment had fundamentally changed the values of this small collective forever. After Ethan Rivers revealed himself to the staff, the meeting room was no longer a place of accusations or rigid debates, but became a space filled with reflection, where every emotion, fear, regret, and hope were all present at once. Ethan stood calmly at the center, his gaze no longer that of a leader accustomed to wielding power to judge right and wrong, but a look of understanding, easy empathy from a man who had pushed reason to its limits to reach the true heartbeat of humanity. He spoke quietly, never raising his voice. I used to believe the system could save everyone, that we didn't need individuals to stand out, only shared rules. But today, I am the one who must learn the greatest lesson. Justice cannot be mass-produced, and kindness cannot wait for the approval of any procedure. He paused, turning toward Mara Lynn, the only one in the room who still held an extraordinary calm after all the upheaval. I will not dismiss you, Ethan declared clearly, because you have not harmed HealthSpring's values. On the contrary, you have reminded all of us of the original goal of medicine, to protect life. A gentle ripple of emotion swept through the room. Tears glistened in many eyes, and the harsh divisions of the initial meeting seemed to dissolve. Ethan continued. Starting next month, Mara Lynn will be the chief advisor for the Hope Bridge Fund, a special program supporting patients who cannot afford treatment, minimizing paperwork, and prioritizing urgent cases at the discretion of compassionate individuals at each branch. All managers and compliance departments will work with me to rebuild our entire process with one principle. The system serves people, not the other way around. That decision left the room hushed. Then quiet murmurs of approval arose from those who had once opposed. A young technician, who earlier had firmly defended the rules, now slowly stood up. I was wrong, Mara. I thought regulations were a fortress, and without them everything would fall apart. But I didn't see that you are the one who keeps this place from becoming heartless. Mara Lynn looked at him and nodded gently. No words of thanks needed. Just a glance of understanding between two people who once stood on opposite sides, now sharing the same sky of compassion. Avery Grant, the once rigid manager who had been silent the whole time, finally spoke. We can't do away with all procedures, but I admit, if all we have are rules and no one willing to do the right thing, then every effort is meaningless. Ethan replied softly, I'm not asking anyone to break the law. But I urge you all to remember, rules only matter if they still hold a soul for humanity. Sometimes, it is the courage of an ordinary person that becomes the driving force for change in an entire system. The meeting ended without applause, just warm glances, thoughtful nods, and shoulders lightened after a long, heavy week. Mara Lynn left quietly, neither proud nor sorrowful. On her face was only a thin but profound smile, the smile of someone who has kept her promise to herself and helped an entire system rediscover its original meaning. Ethan watched Mara disappear down the hallway, feeling as though for the first time in many years, he was not just the head of a company, but of a community of hearts that truly know how to feel and act. Just 1 month after that historic decision was announced, signs of transformation appeared throughout the clinics and pharmacies in the HealthSpring network. Envelopes bearing the words, Hope Bridge Fund, Patient Support, began to show up on counters. Inside were support cards and instruction slips printed in the simplest, most accessible language, with no more overwhelming forms or complicated procedures as before. Hundreds of patients who once hesitated and timidly left the counter now walked out with their heads held high, gratitude shining in their eyes, feeling lighter as they carried precious medicine in their hands. In a small corner of the county clinic, a young mother trembled as she held her child's asthma medication, her face a mix of vulnerability and amazement when the pharmacy staff gently reminded her, "Give it to your child regularly. Let us handle the rest." Somewhere else, a veteran quietly uttered, "I thought society had forgotten me, but it turns out there are still people who want to listen." Mara Lynn's mark was not present in every branch. Her name was never needed on official documents, yet it lingered in the smallest details, a more patient way of greeting, a pharmacist's empathetic gaze, a little ledger tucked into the corner of the desk. It was a silent yet persistent transformation, spreading not just through policy, but through the hearts of each person, those who once flatly refused anything outside of procedure, now willing to listen a few minutes longer, to ask about someone's circumstances, and to take responsibility for their own choices. In the early morning, as mist drifted over the lakeside cemetery, Mara Lynn appeared quietly, carrying a small paper bag with a bottle of heart medicine, the very medication her mother was never able to receive. She sat by the simple stone marker engraved with her mother's name, her eyes dry, hand gently placing the bottle on the grave, whispering, "This time Mother won't be turned away." She did not cry, because that feeling was no longer pain, but the peace of someone who had finally closed a circle of fate, turning loss into a source of hope for a whole new generation of patients. Elsewhere, Ethan Rivers stood in thoughtful silence in the boardroom high above, looking down at the city where every building, every clinic still bore the shadow of the rules he had worked so hard to build. But now he realized the strength of a system does not lie in its ability to control every number, but in the courage to change when someone shows a more humane way to carry out its original mission. After the Westlake event, a flood of emails began pouring into the company's main inbox. Little stories of other pharmacists in far-flung branches who had quietly done the same as Marilyn for years, just never daring to share before. It was no longer the fear of reprimand, but had become the inspiration to build a community of silent hearts within the system. Ethan smiled, knowing that this journey was only just beginning, and if compassion could move an entire machine, what could stop it from spreading beyond the boundaries of a single corporation? As a new spring dawned on the surface of Westlake, people here spoke not only of a kind-hearted pharmacy, but of a legacy reborn from a simple encounter where power, at last, listened to the gentle voice of human kindness. From the perspective of someone who has witnessed hundreds of modern management models and the transformation of many large systems, I can affirm this. The most enduring strength of any organization never comes from rigid rules or flawless reports, but always begins with individuals who are willing to listen to the smallest voice of compassion. When a system knows how to open itself to empathy and put people above every procedure, it not only preserves its original mission, but also creates a true legacy for the community. If today's story resonates with you, please like and subscribe to join us on the journeys ahead where each lesson in humanity will become a turning point for modern leadership thinking. And before you go, don't forget to leave a comment with the phrase, "Choose kindness," because sometimes a single act of kindness is enough to change an entire generation.